All right. I'll have to go back to here. And share. Here we go. I believe everything's working. So if not, it'll be my problem, not yours. So as long as you can.
Everything looks good on our end.
Thank you,
Thank
Karen.
you. Yep.
All right, guys, we're going to talk about winter wheat varieties, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about crop water productivity. So I want to give you an update, and the first update I want to give is we have a new winter wheat breeder. I know most of you know Phil Bruckner retired last spring, and then his second in command, Jim Bird, retired this fall. So there's really nobody in the winter wheat program right now, and we've hired this Sue Mondell, who's coming on in March. She got her PhD at Texas A&M, and then she's been at Summit for the last 10 years in Mexico working on wheat drought and heat tolerant varieties. And so she should be a really good fit for us, and we're really looking forward to her coming on in a couple of months. Jim stayed on long enough to get varieties out, and so we've got winter wheat planted around the state at the research centers. So she's going to come with stuff in the ground and pick up the reins of what Phil left behind. But so it's not a dead program, but it probably will change a little bit of direction. All breeders kind of have their own things what they want to work on, and so here's a picture of Sue, so you'll get to meet her in the coming months. I also want to let you know that you weren't the only ones that had a dry summer. This is just a screenshot from my weather page at here at Huntley, and it goes from April 1st to August 1st. The green line shows the normal precip. We should have had 9.3 inches by the end of July. We had 4.87. So right about the middle of May, things just shut off, and it severely impacted everything because we just didn't get our May, June typical precipitation. And I know you guys didn't either, so it's not telling you anything other than it affected all of us. So hopefully 2022 will be a better year. The likelihood of having two drought seasons back to back is low. It's possible, but let's not hope for that. Let's hope for a better season. I know you know that the variety trial tests go on station and off station all around the state, and they're run by different ones at the research center. This is a shot on a field, I believe, at Northern Ag Research Center. It's actually on farm, and Peggy Lamb runs that system. So the idea is we plant these varieties, which are put together by the breeders, 25 entry set of varieties, and they're planted in a field of the same. So if it's winter wheat, it's planted in winter wheat. And then it's managed by the farmer for the most part, by fertility and by herbicide management. And the only difference is the varieties. We plant the varieties and we come back and harvest those varieties. And so it's a really good test, gives us a lot of different populations to compare and numbers to compare. And I'm going to show you some of those numbers. But just so you know the setup, there's 3 replications, and so it's replicated data. It's a pretty good set of data. Here's Peggy on a combine harvesting. I think this is on station, but it's the same combine that goes off station. All the sample from that plot goes into a bag, and then the bag goes back, and we do the analysis for yield, for test weight, for moisture, for protein, for falling numbers. All those things get analyzed back in the lab. I've got several shots like this that are just PDFs from the report, and I'll show you how to find these yourselves here in a little bit. I'm going to use this little tool where I can zoom in because I know this is a lot of numbers and it's a big screen and it's hard to see. So this, I think, helps you see what we're looking at. This is the 2021 data at the Max Cedarburg farm in Turner. Second column is yield. You can see yield levels are low, around 50, in the teens to 20. If I go to the bottom of each report, you can see the average for those 25 entries is 17.7. Most of these entries, probably 15 or more, are varieties that you can buy, like Northern, LCS Jet, Keldon. But there's also, in Yellowstone, there's also varieties that are still in the testing phase. So there's about 10 entries each year that are included. And these are the varieties that have gone through all, that have been whittled down and give the last look out in the country to see whether we want to release them or the breeding company the breeding people want to release this or not. And you look, the underlying bold on this second column yield shows that this Bobcat stand clear cross is actually the highest yielding at this particular location this year. So this may be one that might get looked at and think about releasing after Sue gets on board here. She may or may not. And anyway, it's just, you look at all these different varieties. 26.6. The other number to remember is just LSD. So that's the least significant difference. So 26.6 minus 3.5 is 23.1. Anything that's above 23.1 and above is in that top yield group. So this stand clear at 24 at this location is in that group. I was hearing some noise that Bobcat didn't perform very well in the triangle area, and I look at this data across all these sites, and it looks like it's performing. Nothing really performed very well. It did fine, I think, in comparison. There's varieties that did poorer, like this LCS Jet did 11.5 bushels at this location. There's some 14s down here for Warhorse and Monument and Clearstone. So it fell off. I'll give you that for this location in Turner. But remember, the Bobcat was brought in for its sawfly resistance. And so if you look at sawfly numbers over here on the right, it's 0.7% cuttings, stems that are cut in that plot, versus I think the high is around probably this 21.7 or 26.7 ACC wildfire. So it does give you really good control of sawfly or resistance to sawfly. So that's the story on that. Test weight and protein, as you look at these data sets, you'll see this inverse relationship. As test weights are low, like they are here, below 60, protein tends to be higher. So that's just kind of, you've got shriveled grain that didn't get plump, that increases the protein content of that grain. And then also yield levels are low, so nitrogen is even more nitrogen was applied than what the yield we attained. I'm going to pop out of that, and this is the same data looked at over a 5-year average. So in this case, I'll zoom in. Here's this Bobcat at 15.8 again, 2021 data. But look back at 2020, and you can see that it actually was a pretty good yielding, 55.7. The average for the trial that year was 52.4. The year previous, the average for the trial was 60.2, and it did 73.4. So I don't see any problem with Bobcat really over the long term. You average it over, it was in the trial for 5 years. Peggy puts this together this way, and you can see that the check yield, which is the percent of Yellowstone is used as a check now. So the average of these yields divided by the average of Yellowstone gives you this 102% of the Yellowstone. So Bobcat over a 5-year period is still above Yellowstone. So and that actually leads the group that's in this group for over 5 years. Actually, it's a 9-year running average. Other ones look really good. This stand clear, and I'll show you some other data where it stands out. Northern seems to be fairly well. 406 is a variety that was released in, I think, 2019. It's basically Yellowstone with a little better bread making qualities. Has a little bit higher test weight, a little bit better resistance to stripe rust, but it's not much different yield wise than Yellowstone on average. Brawl is the other one that'll show up quite a bit in these trials. So Brawl, which is a Clearfield variety, has been doing very well. Let's go to another site. This is going to be at Loma. And again, we'll go to the bottom. Here, yield is in this column. Yield for the trial was 27.6. The high was 36.3. I didn't look at the LSD. The LSD was 4.2. So 36.3 minus 4.2 is 32.1. So anything 32.1 or greater is in that top yield group. Bobcat is just outside that. If I round those two numbers to 32, I would include it. It's in the top. It's right at the top yield group. The other one at Loma has been fairly well. Loma is another Montana variety, Montana state variety. There's this stand clear looking pretty well, 29.1. Again, it was a dry year at this location as well. Test weight's all the way down in the low 50s. Protein is up. And when it's like that, you're not going to have very many that are low in protein. This monument might be the lowest group. They average 15% protein across that. But look at sawfly. This is a much heavier hit location for sawfly. The average is 55, and there's some as much as 74, 76%, 84% cut stems. But look at bobcat at 15.9. So remember, bobcat is there for a reason. It was released mostly because of this. It's one of the better yielding varieties of the solid stem varieties. It's probably the best that we have. So you don't want to throw it out, the baby with the bathwater. It's giving you something even in years where maybe it's dropped off and it's not the top yielder. Again, I'll look at this for that location, how it's averaged over 5 years. And again, bobcat leads the group. And if you look at this percent of the yield, check over the average of the last 5 years, it's 16% better yield than Yellowstone at this location. Yellowstone's down here at 50.4. So 56.2. Brawl is right up there with it. Northern, Keldon, 406. Ray, surprisingly, does quite well. Ray is a variety that was released as a forage variety, kind of to replace or supplement Willow Creek. It has better grain yield than Willow Creek. Willow Creek does not yield very well grain-wise. It was really developed just as a forage wheat, and does very well in that, in doing that. But if you change your mind and want to take it to grain, you're only going to get about 60% of the grain that you would get from any of these other varieties that are more modern grain varieties that are developed for grain yield. I think that's all I got here. I was thinking there was softfly numbers in here, but they're not in here. So yeah, I guess I did that. I modified this from yesterday a little bit. Jed Everly is a professor down at Central Ag Research Center, and he also runs the off-station trials at different locations down around that research farm. And so I want to show you a few of his data, because some of these are up towards where you guys are. You're a little farther away than some of the other locations I've talked about, but it's good to look at multiple locations when you're comparing varieties. So this is Geraldine. And in Jed's case, let me move this thing out of my way, if I can move it. Here we go. Maybe you couldn't see that, but Kim was in front of my panel here, her picture. The yield is 2021, is clear here on the right. The high yield 45.9 at this location. The average 35.3. Bobcat is underneath that in the second group, 38.1. Again, this was a site that was pretty heavily hit by drought, because you can see test weight numbers are down in the 50s, the mid 50s, and protein is up. It's also shorter varieties. It was hit so that it really reduced the height of this crop. These must have been around 30 inches up until now. Flathead is another variety, 35.6, that we'll talk about here in a little bit. That's performing quite well up in your part of the triangle. And it was really not developed for you. It was developed for the Kalispell area. That's why it's named Flathead. It really for stripe rust. It has a very good resistance to stripe rust. It has the highest test weight in this trial here. So it's not a bad variety for you guys, but it was not really developed. It's mostly developed for stripe rust resistance. It doesn't have any sawfly resistance. It's nice to see some of these testing ones. Some of them have been in the upper group. They're not at this location. Let's move on. So this is at Denton, a little farther south from you, but I'll zoom in. I'm going to start at the bottom so you can see the 23.9 is the average. LSD is 7.5. The high yielding one, he didn't underline this one. I think it's 29.6, 29.7. High yielding ones is 406. So 406, if I mentioned this already, is basically a Yellowstone cross that has better baking quality. So it performs a lot like Yellowstone typically, at least in the release it did. So Bobcat again at 28.6, not a bad. It's right up in the top group. So here at this location, even though it was hit pretty hard by a lack of water, performs better down there. Here's one, this MTS 18149. It's also a better yielding one in this environment. So we have some coming along that may get released in the next couple years, but we have some pretty good varieties right now to work with. Here's Belt, also operated by Jed. We'll start again at the bottom. So 56.7 with the LSD of 6.2. This is a much better yielding site. Brawl really did very well. Brawl is a Clearfield variety, so you can pay a little bit more for the seed, but if you've got some grassy weed issues you want to clean up, Brawl might be one to look at. Bobcat at 56, but actually Brawl is just excelled at this location. Everything else fell off from that, and so Northern's a pretty good variety, and it's at 60.1 at this location. And then this is at Judith Gap. I think I'll skip Judith Gap's getting quite a ways east of you, so south, so I'm not sure it's helpful to look at this. Justin Veach is up at Western Triangle, and he's the new superintendent there. He does his research, but he also does variety testing there, and he's starting to do some of the off-station trials. I think the goal is to get somebody else online to help him up there and maybe take over some of the off-station trials at least. But he shared with me Monday this spreadsheet of data, and let me zoom in just to make sure you can see this. I cut off the means for the trial and put it over to the right so it wasn't quite so long. But so the average was 54.9 with the LSD of 14. Bobcat's at the top of that. So Bobcat did good. Northern's done good. At this location, and this was Conrad, so I think they must have got rings that some of the rest of us didn't get because their test weight is up around 60. His protein is quite low, and so I think they exceeded even what they expected to get because it looks like they were short on nitrogen at this location. But Bobcat performed well here. Keldon performed well. Quite a few of these that we've been talking about are still up in that group. If you're not growing one of these ones that are, if you look over several locations that are in the top 10, let's say, you really need to look at this data and critically think about the variety you're growing, because there's no easier way to increase your yield from a field than by just going to a more modern variety. If your variety's 5 to 10 years old and it's showing up the lower part of these trials each year, then you can gain 5-10 bushel just by changing variety. Now to show you one where it was not a very good site. This was data that I collected at Forsyth, Montana, all the way down here in the southern part of the state. The producer called me in June and said he's just going to bail it up because he was afraid it wasn't even going to, the flowering wasn't even going to fertilize to make seed because it was just so hot and dry. I convinced him to leave it so we could look at it. It's about 1/4 of an acre for the trial. So he left it and we went over and harvested it. You can see the trial average was 2.8 bushel per acre. But comparatively, the two that stand out, Flathead and Brawl, did very well. So in under drought conditions, you might look at these if you think we're getting into another drought condition, or if these are in other conditions do well, and Brawl has been doing very well. Flathead has been doing quite well. This is other evidence that's maybe a pretty good variety. These are crappy yields too, right? But compared to 1 or 0.6 for Judy, I think maybe it was worth my time to go to analyze this. We didn't even have enough grain to actually do test weight protein because most bags, the bag I showed you on the side of Peggy's combine, I'd get off the combine and feel the bag and it felt empty. It felt like there's nothing in it. There was very little in several of these bags. So let's talk about these varieties a little bit, the ones that kind of float to the top. So this is Flathead. Flathead was released in 2019. And like I said, it's mostly it's really directed towards resistance to stripe rust. It has 2 genes, so it should have very good long-lasting resistance because having 2 genes control that, just like the Clearfield system that has 2 genes. It's hard to overcome that. It could probably be overcome in the right systems, but this is a very good variety for that. Yield of Flathead, the set of varieties averaged over 2017 to 2019, a lot of locations. It includes across the whole state, so it includes the locations I do here at Southern with Billings, Fort Smith, Hardin, Hysham, Moulton, Rapelje, Belt, Denton, some of the ones I was showing you from Jed, the ones at Western Triangle, used to do Shoto, Cutbank, Lenee, Shelby. All of these have gone into this number. And if you look at this Flathead is 71.2, just below Keldon, but probably at a par with most of these others. This LCS Jet has come on as a pretty good variety as well. And Northern looks pretty well. But this is why it was released, because it yields comparatively to those, but it also has really good stripe rust resistance. So if you look at this table from 2017 to 2018, Brawl had 70% stripe rust where Flathead had 3%. So that's why it's there. It's got really good stripe rust resistance, and that's the main focus of Flathead. Let's go to Ray. So Ray, I mentioned this as well, as a forage wheat that was released in 2018. And I think it's comparable to Willow Creek. It doesn't talk about how it was crossed, so I don't know if it's the exact same genetics that went into Willow Creek or not. But it does quite well as grain yield. So if you look at this table here, this is just forage varieties, and it actually includes a triticale variety. So grain yield, Ray is 38.96 pounds, so that's over 60 bushel. Willow Creek is about 23, about 40 bushel, right? A little over 40 bushel, 40 and a half maybe. 45, I guess is what that would be. So you get a third more grain yield if you take it to grain. If you go to dry matter in tons per acre, Ray was 3.45, Willow Creek was 3.37. They're not different. They're not significantly different. They are different in height. The Ray's shorter. It's around 36 inches, where Willow Creek's around 44. So even with a shorter statured plant, it must hold on to leaves or have a little thicker stems. I'm not sure why the forage dry matter is better or higher, but it is. So it's a pretty good variety, and you saw the grain yield it was doing fairly well. If you look at the grain yield compared against other varieties, you can look across the state. We'll look at Conrad, that's closest to you guys, 64.9 versus Keldon at 69.8. It's not a giant drop off, you know. It still yields pretty well for being a forage type, and average across the state, it's right in that, 6 bushels off the top, so maybe 10% drop. I don't think there's anything over here I want to talk about. Ray, sawfly, it doesn't really give you any sawfly resistance. And now Bobcat. So Bobcat was released in 2019, and the main thing about Bobcat is its sawfly resistance. It's got better yield, probably the best yield of our solid stem varieties. Loma, Judy, Decade, Warhorse. If you look over average, 69.8 versus Warhorse at 65.2. And really good solid stemness. So if you go over here and you look at solid stem, this is Bobcat. So the solid stem rating, and rather than cutting data, is a scale from 5 to 25. And David probably talked about this. But the way they do this is you take 5 stems from the plots, and then you rank each stem from 1 to 5. If it's completely hollow, it's a 1. If it's completely solid, it's a 5. Then you add those together. So as you can see, Bobcat's the most solid of all these varieties, these solid stem varieties. So it's a pretty good yielder. It's leading in a lot of cases the off-station trial, especially average over 4 or 5 years in your location. So I don't think there's anything wrong with Bobcat, and it's a pretty good variety. Oh, I could show you this softfly cutting data down here. Again, it's the same thing. The solid stemness leads to this lower cutting, only 8% versus, varieties that are not designed for that can have a 60% cutting. So, and yield is reflected in that. Northern is another variety that's, I think, is a pretty good variety. It was actually developed by Montana State University to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Northern Ag Research Center in Havre. That's what it's named for. I didn't realize that until I started this talk this week and looked this up. It was sold to Northern Seed, so it's distributed by them. But it's a pretty good variety. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's right around, it averages with these top yielding varieties, and it has pretty good baking qualities. I can't analyze these baking qualities, but it has, I guess, higher numbers means it's the best. And so there's 4 out of all these categories that it's the max in for flour, mixograph, PPO, and kernel. It's under in kernel hardness, but must not be different because that is the highest number there. I can't answer that question. And Loma, I added Loma in just yesterday just because it tends to be one of those that we see all the time. So it was another solid stem variety. It performs in locations where softfly cutting has occurred. Loma, when this was released in 2017, is that when it was released? 2016. So 2017 data shows it's right below Yellowstone. But Loma is a good variety. If you're in Loma, using Loma, and you're collecting your seed and keeping it, I don't know that I would change it. But Bobcat, I think, is a little bit better. This was written before Bobcat was released. Here's Loma cutting, solid stemness. It's a little bit below Warhorse, but pretty good variety. Here's Loma for softfly cutting. Warhorse is a little bit better in this data set. Some of the other varieties are publicly, they're not through the Montana State University, like this Brawl CL Plus, which was doing quite well in the trial. And so if you go to the website Plains Gold, you'll get some data. You won't get any data, but you'll get some glowing specifications about how good this variety is. If you really want to compare the data for any of these varieties that are not produced by Montana State, you need to look at our off-station trials to see the data, because that's the only place that reports the data. If you look at yields, it's reported as good. Well, that's true, it is good, but it doesn't really quantify it for me. Bird CL Plus is also through Plains Gold. Keldon and Stand Clear are through this Nutrient Seed. So if you're looking for those, you want to see pictures and some descriptions of them, go to their website and you'll find that. I didn't show you any of this data. I thought I had some in there, but if I didn't see it this time, this coaxium is a new technology that's come out in the last 10, 15 years, I guess 10, 12 years. Developed at Colorado State. It's a wheat that's been bred to tolerate this quizalofop herbicide. So quizalofop is an old herbicide, probably 30 years old. It's always been out in selection for 30 years. They've teamed up with Aggressor, the company that makes this Aggressor, to make this kind of like the Clearfield type approach. It's you can plant it and then spray over the top Aggressor, and it'll take out grassy weeds. So you can see how clean the strips are where they've used that takes out downy brome, Italian ryegrass, and many other species. You can look at the label and see what other grass species. I even noticed the perennial grasses like barley. It's the perennial barley grass. It takes that out as well. It doesn't have any. There's no broadleaf control, so you will have to tank mix a broadleaf to take care of broadleaves if you're using this system. And it's like Clearfield. You can only grow it half the time. I think their specifications is no more than 3 and 6 years. But really, once you clean up the grassy issues, you probably get it under control. You don't really need to be using this anymore, and all you're doing is putting pressure on it, changing and getting some resistance to it. So look for the AX. Any varieties that have AX in them, that's a coaxium type system. And I see it in the on-station trials, some of the interstate nurseries, that kind of thing. There's 5 to 10 of those in the last couple of years. So I think there's breeding work coming that we may see some MSU. I think Phil was dabbling in that before he retired. So don't be surprised to see some coaxium varieties come along. This technology was turned over to these 3 entities in 2015. The Colorado Wheat Research Foundation, Limagrain, they do the breeding work for developing these varieties. And then Alba is the chemical that provides this aggressor herbicide. And you're required to use, you can buy this Quizalofop in other sources, but it's it's like Clearfield and beyond. You have to buy the aggressor herbicide to be legal in that system. And there may be some additives, other ingredients, some safeners that are added in this that make it work. I don't really know the answer to that, but their goal was to try and find an old chemistry that wouldn't just bankrupt you, to try and use that as a way to control grassy weeds. And so they estimate, at least on the website, this website, about a $15 cost for the herbicide, $15 per acre for that grass control. Now you'll pay more technology fee for the grain, I'm sure, for those varieties than what you could maybe for a MSU variety, but there you go. I'm not going to really talk about spring wheat much. That's all I want to have to talk about for winter wheat, but I want to just kind of talk about the varieties that are available. Vita has been out since I think 2010, 2009, something like that. A very good variety. It's still probably our best variety in the state, and a lot of growth of it. Reader is a variety that came out of North Dakota, and that's still a decent variety. These other ones have been released since that time. Duclair, Lanning, NS Presser CLP, which is a Clearfield type, and it's also marketed through Northern Seed, but it was developed at Montana State. And Dagmar is another variety, and it has some solid stemness for it. You look at yield data, Dagmar is doing pretty good. NS Pressers in that top for this group here. Vita is right there at 66 bushels per acre. I saw one. Egan has jumped out at me. So Egan is a variety that was developed actually was developed in Canada and brought into Northwest as I want to say it was one that's for low soil pH. But that's alum. I'm getting confused now which one. Alum was brought in as one for low pH. Egan was brought in as the it's a insect issue they had over the orange sweet blossom midge is what Egan was brought in for. And it tends to have really high protein. Almost all trials we see Egan in, it's got about a 1% increase in protein. So actually we've been growing Egan down here in our bulk areas for spring wheat because it's a really nice variety. Alum is the variety that was brought in, just alum for aluminum. It has aluminum tolerance. So if you've got low pH soils, and I know there's some soils up in that region where you're starting to see some pH dropping, if you're growing spring wheat, this should perform better in those locations than the rest of these varieties because it has some tolerance to the presence of aluminum. All this data I showed is available online. You can find it under research results on my research or my web page, the Southern Ag Research Center. You just click on here. There's two categories. One's annual reports, and the other one is reports to Montana Wheat and Barley Committee. Look into that Montana Wheat and Barley Committee reports, and you can just go by years. I think there's 20 years worth of data in there, so you can just pull down a report, find that file, and I really encourage you to look at that and look at the latest data and compare how your variety you're growing is doing to varieties that are tested in the region. Because, like I said earlier, that's one way to really improve your yield potential. Is just moving to a more modern variety that has some disease control and insect control that maybe you don't have in the varieties you're currently growing. Additionally, that data, I take the same data that's in those reports and I import it into a database that you can use to combine and look at results from any location, or actually multiple locations merged together in multiple years and get an average across several location years, more than what we can do really by trying to guess ahead of time, what ones you would want to combine. Peggy has those reports with combined, but it's just one location and 5 years of data, or I guess up to 10 years of data. But she doesn't combine them over locations that way. You have to do that yourself. This tool allows you to do that, and I've shown this to you guys in the past, so I think you probably know how to get there. It's pretty easy. Just click on it and play around with it. Go to my website, and I'll repeat that here. Just type in www.sarcmontana.edu. SARC stands for Southern Ag Research Center, so it's pretty easy to remember. Or just Google it, and it'll come up as a link. So that's all I have on varieties. From that, I want to shift gears and talk about water productivity of Montana crops. Since I'm recording this, I think I'll wait and ask questions at the end. But if we have any, keep in mind what questions you have on varieties. We can talk about that at the end. Let's talk about this. This is an extension publication I've been working on for a couple of years, and it should be coming out this spring. I submitted it last fall, and so it's in the at the editor's desk for layout right now, and I'm hoping it'll come out in March. With this publication, it's really the point of it is to try and estimate yield potential of different crops based on your expected rainfall and the soil conditions you have in your location, or how much water is stored in the soil, and then what crop you're growing. So if you know the water balance and you know what's coming, you can give an expected yield based on that. So it's just another tool for you to figure out what crop you would grow next. And this is the publication I'm basically replacing. It's one by James Botter, Paul Brown, Jeff Jacobson, and Hayden Ferguson. It was actually written in the 1980s, and the last printing was in the 1990s. So it's 40-year-old data. It's still good data. It looks at, and this is what mine looks at as well, so available water on the x-axis and then yield on the y-axis. And so this one talks about spring wheat, winter wheat, barley, and oats. And so there's really two things that I'd like to say. One is it's only looking at the small grains. So it'd be nice to look at other crops that we're growing, right? We're commonly growing now peas, chickpeas, canola. There's other crops that you can grow, and it'd be nice to have a fair comparison of their yield potential based on water, available water. And so that's what I've done. I've expanded this to include those other crops. The other thing to think about is this is based on yields of varieties that were prevalent in the 1980s. And so hopefully we've made some gains in the yield potential of these varieties over the 40 years. I know we have, and so this captures a little bit of that. So it was time to update this publication. Kind of to set the stage, I want to use this chart, and this is from publication 2001 in Australia. So the units are all screwy, and the data is collected on the other side of the world from here. But it's winter wheat, and it looks at the yield of wheat in a semi-arid environment to increases in moisture. So as water and rainfall goes up, yield tends to go up. So this is a collection of this guy's studies over multiple years, and anything that's connected by a line is a particular study. So maybe this was a variety trial, Or maybe this was a nutrient trial with high and low nitrogen rates or phosphorus rates. Or maybe it's an insect trial where you had pressure and you didn't have pressure, or disease pressure, varieties that had resistance or didn't have resistance, that kind of thing. He decided, rather than try and plot a line through the middle of this, just a boundary line shows you the upper limit of what is possible for a variety of wheat, or for wheat production, if the only thing that's limiting is yield. Or I mean, only thing that's limiting is water. One thing limiting yield is water. So if these two, one is limiting water, this variety here is not limited by much. It's closer to that line. The slope of that line, if you convert all the units, is around 7.5 bushels per acre per inch. A pretty high. This is this crop water productivity number, 7.5 bushels per acre per inch of water. So for every inch of water gained, so you get an inch of more precip, you're getting how many bushels more do you get? That is what crop water productivity is. So I was looking for sites that had that to make a fair comparison. Let me go back. So all these are real points, right? And so these really represent different environments. So let's say where I stopped the mouse right there on that, if you had a study that had multiple crops growing at that location in a replicated study, then you have the same environment. So you can look at the relative response of, let's say, canola to spring wheat at that location, and then average that over multiple locations. You get a much better feel for how crops respond relatively. We're not every year going to reach this. We may never reach this 7.5 bushel per acre per acre inch, but we can look at the relative response of different crops. So looking for studies that had multiple crops in them, I found this one from Bozeman by Perry Miller that grew barley, canola, lentil, pea, millet, the wheats, sunflower, chickpea, camelina, and safflower for 4 years, and had so you have all these, and he measured soil water use, crop water use. So you've got yield, and you've got the crop water use from rainfall plus soil sampling. This crop rotation trial in Mandan, same thing. It was buckwheat, canola, chickpea, corn, pea, sorghum, lentil, millet, sunflower, and spring wheat, all grown in a study. And I've shown this data in different ways, but they also measured water use. So they have yield per inch of water. And then I've got a study going on here at Huntley, and it's being repeated by Chintzy and Sydney on chickpeas and peas, and I've included spring wheat here so I can see the water response. And what we do here is we have a drip irrigation system, so we add increments of water, and then we go back and soil sample at the beginning of the season, the end of the season again, and so we can get yield per inch of total water use. The one thing all these have in common is spring wheat. So I can take all the yields and then make relative to spring wheat, and then I can combine those. And so that's what I did. I took crop water productivity from Montana crops, comes from the average of all those relative responses to spring wheat. So this is the average over all those studies for where they have the same crop. So they're not the same number of values going into each one, but it's a replicated version that gives you I think a good estimate of relative response. So winter wheat is right similar to spring wheat, just a little bit better yield per inch of water than spring wheat. Barley drops off from that. Pea and lentils are quite a bit less. You come down here, safflower is almost the same, about 0.90, like 96% of the yield of spring wheat. So that gives me the relative values. Then I took the average of spring wheat at all the Montana locations. I did not include the North Dakota location because that's a long ways from us. So the crop water productivity for spring wheat average was 251 pounds per acre per inch. Then take 251, take this column times 251, and you get this column. So this is the pounds per acre inch of all these different crops divided by the test weight, and you get bushels per acre inch. So you can see here that the crop water productivity of wheat is around 4.2. Barley is just under that at 4.1. Safflower is actually higher than that. Its pounds is lower, but it's such a low test weight that when you talk in terms of bushels, it's higher yield. This is probably the most important table in this publication, and this was the hardest to come up with and give it a fair assessment. I feel like I did a good job of doing that. Perry shared that data with me, and the Mandan data really helped supplement that. So that's one point we need to make this estimate for crop yield. The next thing we need is water input, right? How much water are you going to get in this year if that's what's limiting yield? And I know you've seen this kind of data before. This is actually from Great Falls Airport, and the green bars are the monthly precipitation. So you can just add up these numbers, and that would give you an estimate of how much water you should expect this is the average over 30 years. But every year is different, and so the probability doesn't really come into this. This is just the mean. So that's one way, and I'll show you another way here in a second. The other thing to think about is what kind of intensity of storms do we get? And so I took data here at Huntley for another publication I just submitted, and I took the last 10 years of data, 2011 to 2020, and I averaged that and then divided it by 10. So you come up with the number of days per year over a 10-year period that you're going to get 0.01 inch of water or less in a precipitation event. So 23 rain events were less than 1/100th of an inch. 38, or about 38, were 1/10 of an inch or less, 1/10 of an inch down to 0.01. So that doesn't sound like very much, 1/10 of an inch, but the 1/10 of an inch times 38 events is 3.8 inches, which is more than a third of our total rainfall here. So this is a pretty significant amount. You add the third of an inch down to 1/10 of an inch times 20, and then you're getting another 6 inches of precip. So the majority of our precip comes in these really small events. I think you could argue that anything under 1/100th of an inch is probably not very effective. Most of it probably evaporates before it actually gets to the soil. But this 1/10 to a third to almost a little over 1/2 of an inch, these rainfall do make it to the soil, and that's where the water needs to go into the soil so it can be taken up by the plant. It doesn't take it up from its leaves, it takes it up through its roots. And so you've got to get it down in the soil and then protected so it doesn't evaporate. 1/10 of an inch on bare soil with no protection and the wind blowing could evaporate quite a bit of it. So our no-till systems that really protect that soil surface really harvest this amount of water a lot better than if you go farther south and east into the Great Plains, where I grew up in western Kansas, there's a lot of 1 to 2 inch rainfall events. If you look at this, there's less than one rainfall event at Huntley in the last 10 years that was approaching 2 inches. It actually was, the highest rainfall was 1.9 inch. We had 8 events between 1.5 and 2 inches. So we don't get a lot of big rainfall. But down south of here, they do get. But when you get a 2 inch rain or a 3 inch rain, most of that runs off in those areas. So these are not very effective at getting into the soil. These are. So that's kind of the difference in environment. This chart really tells you why we can make much better use of our water, a rainfall we get in Montana than you can in Colorado or Nebraska or Kansas. We have a lot more small rains, a lot less intense rainfall, which is a good thing. So I worked with the state climatologists at the University of Montana, and they developed this map, which is similar to the map was in that original publication. So it's the median accumulated precipitation in a lat-long orientation. So this is a 30-year, it's a 50-50 chance of getting rainfall using the last 30 years worth of data. So where you guys are in Toole County, it looks like the northern part of the county might get around 6 to 7 inches of precip. You might expect 6 to 7 between May 1st and July 31st, and the southern half would be in that next category, 5 to 6 inches of rainfall. The blue are the mountains. So if you could farm on top of the mountains, you'd have plenty of rainfall, but you'd have pretty shallow soils and you have to fight trees as weeds. So I don't think that's going to work. So this is a number that you can get for precip right here. So our forecast for precipitation, I just saw it last night. Ed McIntosh was talking about a wetter than normal winter coming for most of Montana. And so they now can do about a 3-month forecast to say, well, in the next 3 months, it's going to be wetter than normal or drier than normal or normal. That's about as good as they get at predicting anything beyond about a week. So if you're in this and you've got a 5 to 6 inch expectation that's going to be wetter, let's go 6 to 7 inches. Use those kind of numbers. And so it's got to give you a good ballpark number to make this comparison. Remember, the rain is our input. Unless you're irrigated, all the water comes from the rainfall. And so it has to get into the soil. So you need to know the soil type you have and the soil depth you have to know how much water you're going to store or how much water is available in there. Not only do you need to know the soil depth, but if you're growing a crop like peas, it doesn't matter if you've got 10 foot of silt loam soil that can store water and maybe it's wet to 10 feet. If they're only going to root down to 3 feet, you effectively have a 3-foot profile for that coming season. So, and you're not going to gain any more soil in your lifetime or my lifetime or your grandkids' lifetime because it takes millions of years to form soil. Really, all you can do is lose soil unless you gain it from your friends and neighbors that it's blowing in on top. But mostly the soil you have is the soil you're going to have. So how much water can that soil store? So this is a chart that kind of gives you a way for me to explain that. So initially, let's just talk about how much the soil stores water in its pore space. So how much pore space does a normal soil have? It's about 50%. So if you have a compacted soil, it may be less than that. But if a soil is in good shape, whether it's a sandy soil or a clay soil, a good rule of thumb number is 50% pore space. 50% of voids and 50% of solids. So the sand, silt, clay, the earthworms, the roots, things that take up space, take up that void space, is what limits how much void space there is for water. So the water and air kind of take turns filling up that void space. So let's assume it's a completely wetting event and we saturate the surface and we go to that 50% of the void space is full of water. The maximum amount water content you could have would be 50%. It's going to immediately start draining by gravity down to lower soil profiles or eventually down to groundwater if the whole profile gets saturated. And a sandy soil will drain pretty quickly. And if you took a sample the day after a soaking rainfall like that, that profile would probably be around 15% by volume water content. Whereas a clay soil, after a day or maybe 2 days of draining, will be down around 40%. And the difference is just clays really have a lot of surface area, tremendously greater amount of surface area that can cling on to water droplets. The absorption ability of clay is way higher than sand. So it holds onto that water down to this field capacity line. Now the other limit is the wilting point line. So the wilting point line is when you're growing a crop, if you took a sample, once you start to see that crop start to wilt due to it just can't get water anymore out of it, that's considered the wilting point. If you analyze the soil sample, a sand to be around 5 to 10% volumetric water content. There's still some water there. It's just not accessible by the plant. The solid surfaces absorb that water at a higher tension than what the plant's roots can take it from them. And clays hold it even more, up to around 20%. A tremendous amount of water held that's not available to the crop. The difference in those two lines is the plant available water. So you just have to subtract one for the other and you get that number. And so I've developed this table which shows you numbers to use for fine sand, loamy fine sand, 0.6 to 1.2 inches per foot, whereas the clays and clay loams go from 1.6 to 2.4 inches per foot. If you look back at this chart, the clay soil, you actually see the difference between this line and this line is less than it is in this region. It's just because of the change of these slopes of these lines, you've got a little bit greater water in a clay loam, a silty clay loam. They hold the highest amount of water, around 2.4 inches per foot. So there's another thing we need to know for this calculation I'm going to show you in just a minute. So this data from Perry, he gave me, they also looked at soil water content at the end of the season. That's how they quantified water use. So this is a picture of the profile, and I'm not even showing the top 2 feet, 1 and 2 feet. He went to 6 feet and soil sampled and did analysis to figure out what the water content was remaining right at harvest time. And the soil is a Amsterdam silt loam. It holds around 1.1 to 1.2 inches of water per foot. So look at the safflower and sunflower. They can access water all the way down to 6 feet, especially safflower. It's only got around 0.2 inches of water left. And at the beginning of the season, he verified they were all full at the beginning of the season. And so rooting is not a problem for safflower to reach down to 6 feet. Sunflower, probably 5 to 6 feet. You see some little less extraction from that deeper profile for sunflower. Let's compare it to lentils and peas, where there's virtually no water removed in that 6-foot depth. That's not really a surprise to anybody. The 5th-foot depth, you can kind of see there's a little depression of water. So water has been removed from that 5-foot depth. So the question is, and nobody really talks about lentils and peas rooting down that deep, but they probably do. They probably put 1 or 2, a minor number of roots into that lower profile, and they can extract some water from that, but it's not enough to make a measurable difference. So we talk it in terms of rooting depth. We really should talk in terms of effective rooting depth, because they're effectively not removing any from that 5th foot. There is a difference here in that 3rd foot. Lentils remove a lot more water than peas from the 3rd foot. So lentils definitely can root down a little deeper than peas. Just like winter wheat roots down a little bit more than spring wheat or barley. And you can see the height of these borers here for the 3rd and the 4th feet. They just stair step up. And canola is kind of in between those. So from this data and from other data looking at it, I've come up with this table for maximum effective rooting depth. Winter wheat around 5 to 6 feet, safflower 5 to 6, corn and sunflower 5 to 6 feet, lentils 3 to 4, and dry peas 2 to 3, chickpeas a little deeper at 3 to 4 feet, and canola 3 to 4 feet. So those are the numbers we're going to use for the effective rooting depth. So we're about at the end. I want to just show you how you make a calculation that we'll do in this publication. So here's an example. We'll assume that's March and the field is moist soil to 48 inches. So you've taken a Paul Brown probe out and you probe down, and at 48 inches it rejects. And so you're either hitting bedrock or you're hitting dry soil, but you can't probe any deeper than that. So we know it's wet to 48 inches. The soil profile it's a soil texture for the 0 to 0.5 and a silt loam from 0.5 to 4. It's in Cascade County. So from figure 4, we estimated we should get 5 inches of precipitation from May 1st to July 31st. So let's first do the soil water. A sandy loam should hold 1.2 inches per foot, times a half a foot would give you a 0.6 inches of water. Silt loam is 3.5 feet times 1.8 inches per foot, gives you 6.3. You add that together, you get 6.9. This is for a spring wheat crop. We're going to say it's going to root down to 4 feet. We'll say peas, they're not going to root that deep. They're only going to root to 3 feet. So the number should be the same, except for the second number is going to be reduced to 1.8 times 2.5. So that's 4.5. So we get 5.1. And then let's compare it to safflower. So we know safflower will root down deeper than 4 feet. So we could make this a 5 or a 6. But in my example, I said you were rejected at 48 inches. So we're not going to give credit unless we can verify there's water at that depth. So we'll use the same numbers for it as for spring wheat. We carry those numbers over here, 6.9, 5.1, 6.9. Add in the precipitation. 6.9 plus 5 is 11.9 times 3.8 bushels per acre inch. That first table I talked about, you get 45 bushels per acre. You do the math on all of them, you get 45 bushels of spring wheat versus 25 bushels pea versus 36 bushels of safflower. So there you go. There is a way to fairly compare the productivity of 3 different species and help make a decision about what crop you want to grow next season. You know, this is just one value that goes into it. You need to know the price that you're going to get for spring wheat, or the price for peas, or the price for safflower. You need to know the nitrogen costs that go in. You know, what's the fertilizer cost going to be? Maybe it's worthwhile with this comparison to grow peas for this year because I'm not going to have to put in the fertilizer costs. So anyway, that's what this publication is all about. I hope you look for it. I'm hoping it'll come out this spring. There's been some turnover in that office, and so it's sitting right now at an empty desk waiting for either a new hire or the lady that's been sitting at the desk to come back to work, because I haven't heard from her since I sent it there in October. So I guess maybe it's November. But that's all I have. We can open it up for questions. The last thing I want to do is I'm involved in a study. It's a 3-year study that is looking at chickpea and flax intercropping. So anybody that's interested in chickpea or intercropping, uh, there's a survey I'd like you to take, and it'll take you maybe 5 minutes of your time. You can scan this code in with your smartphone if you want, and it's on. I know that Kim hopefully has some hard copies of them there as well, and they're on that as well. So either do the survey on your phone or at home when you get home, or do it on the paper copy, and she'll get them back to me. You don't have to be a chickpea farmer, but if you have any interest in intercropping or in chickpeas in general, I would appreciate some feedback from you. We're going to do this study because there's been some interest in Canada and in doing this to try and improve chickpea production, mostly for ascochyta control. But we don't really know how that works, and so this should help us understand that. So any input you can give us would be very appreciative. Thank you. So with that, Kim, I'm going to stop. I'll leave this up like that, and maybe turn my camera back on if I can find it.
Thanks, Kent. Does anybody have any questions for Kent? If you want, you can just come up here and ask, or just yell it out and I'll ask him.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any.
I can't seem to figure out where my camera is to turn it back on, so maybe I have to stop sharing my PowerPoint to do it. So I'll do that. There we go. There, I'm back.
There you are.
See, I was here all along. I wasn't just a recording. So if you don't have any questions, you can send me an email. I'd be glad if it's something dawns on you after you leave the meeting and you wanted to ask. I'd be glad to talk to you.
Okay.
Hear somebody.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kent.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim.
Yep. Have a good day. Good luck at your next presentation.